Hailing back from the days of Medarot Dual, this symbolic representation of Apollo is ready to grace the field with a shining, radiant beam of light. It is APN00 Iliako Force, with a kit of Hyper Laser, Static, Power Sword, Biped Legs, and the leg ability of Brilliance, which will passively restore just a little bit of HP to all active parts every time he charges Metaforce. Now, Iliako Force is a model that's actually seen the world of 3D for a pretty hot minute ever since the days of the 3DS era, especially with the introduction of Medarot Dual and a lot of pairs that were introduced in that game. Iliako Force and his twin of Fegaro Force, based off of Artemis, is most certainly no exception to this rule. And both twins are introducing skills that were previously only exclusive to collaboration-only bots as they prepare to grace the field with the power of the sun and of the moon. Hyper Laser on the head part is an optic attribute shooting skill, which gets a times 1.5 damage bonus at 30% charge and a times 2 bonus at 100%. But in contrast to regular laser, which normally will take that as far as the bonuses go, Hyper Laser hits notably harder though, as you see here with a base power of over 1700. It's also worth noting that Hyper Laser also is packing Defense Ignore at its full charge, much like, say, Ghost might, or even Microwave might at some point. So this means this laser is going to hit much, much harder than that of a regular Optic Attribute skill, and when fully charged might even possibly rival that of Hyper Beam, with not nearly as many penalties on the cooldown if used correctly. Static on the right arm is a shooting skill which has a very unique type of attribute to it, and that attribute specifically is that upon attacking an enemy part, it will immediately cut down that part's active HP total from whatever it was to 50% of that active remaining HP. So this means if the part was at 100% HP when you attack it, well, guess what? That's 50% right off the top with no additional damage bonus, conditions, or requirements in order to do so. And if you attack it again, well, that's 50% of that, and 50% of that, and so on. Basically assume this is kind of like Super Fang from Pokemon, where it's incapable of breaking anything on its own, but it makes it a lot easier for Iliako Force to come up with a follow-up attack, whether that mean Hyper Laser or Power Sword, to really finish the job well and make it a whole lot easier for breaking things with follow-up blows coming behind. Speaking of following up with other attacks, Power Sword on the left arm is a conventional shooting skill, conventional melee skill, but also has a times 1.5 damage bonus to it as long as Iliako Force's legs remain intact. So this honestly means it's going to be a very powerful blow no matter which way you choose to use it, and given the fact that it's also a non-heavy part, means that you can fit this basically anywhere with a lot of very consistent performances overall, especially since fairly recently they also were buffing both power nature attacks such as power rifle, power sword, power napalm, and so on, to remove one of the cooldown penalties and make them a whole lot easier to use on the back end. So this is a very consistent and very well-rounded part that you really can't go wrong with using for any of your dedicated melee fighters. Biped Legs means that Iliako Force will have pretty solid coverage across most terrains remarkably well, and pretty well diverse terrain compatibility on top of that. But one thing to note about Iliako Force is that compared to a lot of models that we've been seeing in recent with base mobilities in the 8 or even 900s, Iliako Force is kind of chugging behind a little bit, as you see here, with a base mobility of 786. Now that's not to say that he's terrible or he's definitely not using or won't be fast on the field, because he actually is quite speedy still all the same, but he will need a little bit of help on the back end, and definitely try not to expect him being the first to the line in a lot of situations. He's going to be designed mostly as a follow-up attacker or a more of a second hit attacker more than anything else than a frontline first turn fight. As far as armor is concerned, he's packing about 3839 for the head, about 3600 per arm, and just over 4000 for the legs, which will suit him in a very solid and pretty well-rounded point as far as armor is concerned. And as far as his other leg stats are, by the way, an evade of 1129 is also very nice, as it means he can dodge and graze pretty consistently well as he sees fit, especially with a lot of very low success or very blind attacks. And With a melee resist of 1302 and a shooting resist of 1159, it's a pretty well-rounded leg that you can use pretty consistently anywhere. So he can fight up close, he can fight at range, and really not see too much of a difference or hindrance in his performance across the board. So compared to a lot of other fighters which tend to have very heavy emphasis on, say, shooting or melee, and then maybe have one small part that's used to kind of complement or supplement it to a point, Iliako forces a model that can kind of hold his own in both fields as kind of a jack of all trades, so to speak, with a lot of coverage between the three skills he brings to the table. All this being said, though, as a pure set score, I honestly still have to rate Iliako Force a pretty well-rounded 7.5 out of 10. Given that his kit is kind of weird between Hyper Laser, Static, and Power Sword, it is weirdly synergetic if you're able to use it correctly. Ideally, the best kind of turn order that you'd be using in this case would be starting along the lines of, say, Static to really start whittling the enemy HP down, and then you'd follow up behind it with a finisher with Power Sword. And then, if you have the correct nature, such as, say, Hunter or Sniper nature, then you'll start getting a Metaforce charge going. Then, when you have enough of a charge that you're satisfied with, you can fire off with a very radiant smile from this man himself with Hyper Laser and absolutely decimate anyone in his path. And if he does end up taking just a little bit of damage along the way, he is able to restore just a little bit of it to all parts with Brilliance in the case of an emergency insurance situation. As mixed parts, I do have to rate him equally at a 7.5 out of 10 as well for these same reasons. Even though his kit is weird, it is still very synergetic unto itself, and as mixed parts, you can see a very consistent performance as well. Whether that means you exchange, say, Static for something else, or make him all shooting and replace Power Sword with something else, or if you choose to use any of these skills across the board on other bots or even in your mixed builds, there's still very consistent and well-rounded parts you really can't go wrong with using. Hyper Laser you might not use super often because it is not a heavy slot, and B, it is a CG reliant skill on a head, which means charging for it is going to take a little bit of time, but with Static and Power Sword on the arm, and neither of them are heavy, you're probably going to have a much easier time fitting them into your teams elsewhere. And while his legs may not be the first instance or the first part you're going to reach for, they're still very well rounded all the same, and just a very overall synergetic model you really can't go wrong with using fresh out of the box.